All right, I'm happy to be joined by the teaching and learning team as they come up to the tables and help to share some of this information. As you all know, in April of each year, we have the Learning Report, which really focuses on our district success measures, our social emotional learning, personalized learning, the 4 C's, student satisfaction, kind of those things that are more, if you talk about data, are more qualitative in nature. And tonight our focus really is to talk about the quantitative data of our student learning. So this gives another layer to what learning outcomes look like within Lindbergh as we talk through our kindergarten through 9th grade assessments and then go into some of our high school assessments as well. So if you go to the next slide, I really want to frame this by talking about how we look at this data as a baseline. As you know from our April workshop, I think it was April, maybe it was May, and talking about our Compass goals for this upcoming school year, really focusing in on that 80% or greater, we don't want to limit ourselves to 80% of students meeting the average or above average quintiles in our NWEA MAP growth, and then really focusing on that 3rd grade reading data that we are ensuring that our kids are reading at levels that are proficient. So 80% plus of our 3rd grade students who are considered low risk, because that's the indicator that's on the assessment, in both FastBridge A reading and CBM assessments. And it's important that both of those are paired together because as we talk about the skill sets that we develop in students, we want to make sure that that development is even. That as we focus on foundational elements of reading, we are also continuing with the work around building comprehension and background knowledge, vocabulary, et cetera, to make a holistic reader. So those are our goals to kind of frame the work that we're going to talk about from the data in this last school year. Some things to keep in mind with regard to this data. This is our 4th year of using FastBridge assessment. So we began in the 18-19 school year, then continued in 19-20 where we had incomplete data due to the pandemic, and then over the last 2 years. This is our 2nd year with NWEA MAP growth assessment, and then our 1st year with the iReady assessments that we use in elementary math. So that kind of helps to frame like the trajectory of the work that we've been doing. And while we never want to focus the data around the pandemic, we also can't ignore that there have been significant impacts with regard to student learning, not just within Lindbergh, but nationally, internationally, really. In fact, there was recently just an article released that showed NWEA was reporting that they're seeing an up to 10% increase in the variance of students testing. So they're seeing greater spread of students' test scores than they've ever seen before. We're also seeing upwards of 12 percentile point decrease nationally in some of the data. So that is something that we have to frame and keep in mind as we're looking at where Lindbergh performance is. All of our data that we are sharing with you tonight is based on pre-pandemic norms. So as we're looking at the data and we're looking at where Lindbergh students are, these are norms that were set in either 2019 or 20 prior to the pandemic. And then again, going to this idea of baseline, we're going into this next school year with the expectation that we're going to be able to return to the professional learning that we have done in the past, things like horizontal and vertical teams in order to have that alignment both among the levels of teachers, but also then between grade levels to get back to some of those processes that we haven't been able to do because of limited access to subs and so forth. So I will say that we thought that would be the case last year as well, and had to use Dr. Lake's favorite word, pivot a bit. But really looking forward to this year and being able to get our typical trajectory back. And with that being said, I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. Jill Lawson, who is our Executive Director of Assessment and Student Services. She is going to go through the assessments and what the metrics mean, and then followed by her will be Dr. Craig Hamby, Executive Director of Elementary, to talk about elementary data, and then Dr. Ronnie Zagora to talk about secondary as the Executive Director of Secondary Education. So at this point, next slide, please.
Okay, well, thank you so much Okay, thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and share a little bit about our assessments in Lindbergh Schools and how we measure academic monitoring. So just to share with you the 3 assessment platforms that we use, iReady, as Tara stated, is our very first, this is our very first year using this assessment, and we administer it to students K through 3 in mathematics. FastBridge is a reading screening tool that we use K through 3 to measure early reading skills. And we, like Tara stated, started using that in 2018-19. And then NWEA is an assessment tool that we use for students 4th through 8th grade in mathematics and 4th through 9th grade in reading. And the 9th grade just began administering that assessment this year. Next slide. This particular slide is here for your reference. On it, you'll see the grade level for kindergarten through third grade reading assessments, the actual tests within the platform that we use to administer to that particular grade level, the window in which we administer it, and the description of what is actually measured within that tool. So for kindergarten through first grade, you'll see that we administer early reading. We do that for first grade in fall, winter, and spring. And this past year in kindergarten, it was in winter and spring only. But I just want to share that in 2022-23, we will be administering it to kindergartners fall, winter, and spring. Students in first through third grade participate in CBM reading. So we'll have assessment data to share with you on that. And then second and third grade participate in A reading and auto reading. So you can refer back to this as we move through data. Because we use 3 different assessment platforms when trying to design the visualization for you, I wanted to have some consistency throughout. So on each of the particular assessment grade level, I guess the data that we share, I wanted to have the mean score for Lindbergh Schools in 2022 in comparison with the assessment platform's mean score. And within that, I put 2019 for FastBridge because that's when the benchmark and norms were published, and the same for iReady was also 2019. So you'll be able to see when those are, because for NWEA, their benchmark and norms were published in 2020. So just so you could see the particular year. But as Dr. Sparks mentioned, they were all published prior to the pandemic. And also within those particular assessment platforms, each of those display a performance level. And for consistency, I use the term performance level, but depending on the platform, it may be considered a risk level, a placement level, and in NWEA, they refer to it as the quintile level. So, but for consistency, tonight, we're going to have those titled performance level. So within FastBridge, we have high risk, some risk, low risk, and college pathway. And then because iReady, and Dr. Hamby will explain this more, is I guess displays their data in more of where students fall in accordance to where they should be by the end of the year. It is more of a placement level for students. So that is where we are going, that is how you will see all of the charts throughout this presentation. Next slide. So we are going to take a satellite view of our data, but as we look at it through a satellite view, I wanted to just take you for a moment, just one slide, into what we are actually doing within our district to monitor student growth. So we can look at percentages and means and comparisons, but within those numbers are individual students who are working very hard and teachers who are also working very hard to help students grow from where they come in at the beginning of the year and where they leave us at the end of the year, and so on throughout their experience at Lindbergh Schools. So I wanted to give you an example of a data wall. This is just a small clip of a data wall for early reading, this a composite score, and looking at individual students' scores, where they started in this particular one in the winter and where they ended in the spring, just to see that we can look at colors. The green obviously illustrating low risk, yellow illustrating some risk, and red here illustrating high risk. And that is one way to look at data. But there's also numbers within those colors of where students go from where they start with us and where they end. And just to show you the growth that is happening for our particular students. When it does happen, it needs to be recognized and celebrated. And when it doesn't happen, it needs to be acknowledged and addressed as well. So one of the things looking at this, I know our teachers have done a great job doing, and we'll continue to reinforce this through professional learning and just opportunities to sit down and talk to teachers about their data, is really getting our students involved in setting goals, helping our teachers think about setting goals for their classroom, and then also from the district level, how are we setting goals, as Tara mentioned on the very first slide, of where do we want our students to be, to know that our programs and the things we have in place are effective. So that is just one of the things I wanted to share about our early reading composite. Also on there, I'm so sorry if you could go back. Also on there, I have that 89% of our students in first grade with IEPs show growth in early reading from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And that is actually a really great thing. That is something to definitely recognize and celebrate. However, you won't always see that represented when you're looking at a satellite view of where our students are from high risk, low risk, and some risk. So I think that is one of the things that we need to acknowledge, but I'm also going to have a big however in there. And one of the things that we also have to acknowledge is that our students who are struggling require aggressive growth to ever move out of a particular performance level. So a student who has an IEP, or maybe doesn't even have an IEP, but a student who is performing with some indicators of risk has to have the attention and the understanding teachers that we have to be very aggressive. Acceleration is the key, because as we move through the assessment windows, the benchmark keeps rising and rising and rising. So if students are not provided with appropriate interventions involved in the setting goal process for themselves, and also given that opportunity to celebrate when they are showing growth, we're going to continue to see our students stay within the same risk levels, even if they are showing growth throughout the year. So I'm kind of celebrating and also saying the need for accelerated growth, and being aggressive is a need, or students will never move out of those particular risk levels, performance levels. So I'm going to turn this now over to Dr. Hamby to share.
Do you guys have any questions for Jill before he gets into specific stuff about just our program? Assessments, okay. Good.
Was yellow, what was yellow?
For that particular data wall that I had up, that was some risk.
Some risk.
Mm-hmm.
So it was red, green, yellow.
Yes.
And some risk may be like there's one deficit skill that exists that a student, we need to remediate. High risk generally is there's multiple skills that need some specific attention.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to start with kindergarten. The next 67 slides are mine. So sit back, relax. Just 67, they cut out some of mine. So kindergarten early reading, so this is a test that's going to measure some very specific skills. We have 4 sub-skills that we're looking at with our kindergarten readers. And what we have on there in the top graph is you have our winter scores and our spring scores. And you have green is Lindbergh and the gray is the national average. And that's the FastBridge national norm from 2019. So it's not all kids across the nation, it's just those schools who are using FastBridge. And it's their norming from when they did 2019. So when you look at it, we grew 14.12 points over the year, and the national norm was 15.28, so we were off the pace, just 1.16 points, which not horrible, but at the bottom, that's one where we want to do better on that bottom one. And as you can see, the good news on the bottom graph is you look at the spring graph, and we have 44% of our kids are in the low risk, where we want to be in the green. The previous year's kindergartners had only 38 there. And at the bottom, where we're at 16 in the high risk, where we don't want to be, previous year we had 19 there. So while it doesn't look great in comparison to the fall, when we compare it to the year before, moving in the right direction. What I want to say with that is, and kind of to go along with what Jill said on the last slide, that's just the satellite view. So what we have to do, and you're going to hear me say this several times tonight, is a deeper dive into the data. So when I see those 16% in the red, I need to know what's going on. I need to know what's happening with those kiddos. So we have to dig in and find out, okay, who are those kids? What services are they receiving? And exactly what skills were they deficient in? So the first thing that Sarah Valter and I did When we got the spring scores, I was like, there's got to be a trend. There's got to be one of those skills that we were deficient on. Word segmenting is tough for those kindergarten kids. I bet it was that. Let's see if that was the case. There were absolutely no trends or patterns that we could discover whatsoever. It was one class had done well at this, another class did well at this, one building did well here, another building did well here. So I said, well, let's look at the pilot classrooms versus the classrooms we're using our traditional materials. No difference. It's just no patterns or trends. So it's almost classroom by classroom, kid by kid. We have to dig in and see what we can do, which is fine. We're into responsive teaching. We want to meet the kids where they are and do the best we can for them. So we dig into it like that. It's easier if it's like, oh, we just got everyone has to do better at word segmenting. Well, there were no easy answers for us this time around. So when I say the deeper dive, we get into that 16%. And we look and find out, well, okay, exactly what skills, which kids need what skills, and then we have to have conversations with teachers like, okay, and it's not anything where we say, hey, we didn't do well enough. It's like, we didn't do as well as we expected. What do we think we need to change? How can we serve these kids? We also need to look, if we got some kiddos that are down there and they're hitting some yellow and red boxes, it's okay. Do they have all the services they need? Are we providing enough support for these kids? We don't want anyone to slip through under our radar through the net. We want to make sure we're consistently looking at this data to keep up with them. But also in that deep dive, and kind of back to what Jill said on the previous slide, even though they're in the red in the satellite view, we can't live and die just in these risk levels. Because we could dig into that 16%, those red kids, and I bet you almost 100% of them showed growth over the year. They were better at the end of the year than when they walked in the door with us at the beginning of the year. Now, they didn't keep the pace we wanted them to keep, but they grew. They became better readers. But where I can use that to say, hey, these kids are still learning, I'm going to use it against myself because I also have to check those 44% of kids in the green. Did they also grow? Because I can't just let them say, oh, this kid could read when he comes in. I don't have to do anything with him. No, everybody has to grow. And we'll talk a little bit about, so one of the things that I kind of kept track at across the graphs and the charts is high growth and high performance. So you're going to hear me say sometimes like we outperformed the national average and we also outgrew the national average. So I'm was looking at both for our performance but also our growth. So it's going to be a recurring trend because we're always looking for that growth. Sometimes we didn't keep the pace we wanted to. Sometimes we just got to get in there and make sure that all those kids are growing. And sometimes the difference between being red and green might be 3 points. Might be one skill, just a few points, and all of a sudden you went from high risk to you were on track. But you have to dig deep into the data sometimes to find out exactly what we have to do there.
Can I interrupt with one question? All right, so I think you're going to tell me that I need to wait until we get to those graphs you were just talking about, because when I look at this, I don't see any growth. It's hard. You don't see growth because it looks like the kids who were green fell to yellow and everybody else stayed the same. And so are you going to tell me that I need to look and see each individual kid and where they went in order to understand this?
Colin, can we slide to the left and go back one slide? All right, so in this one, gives us a good example. So that student, if you look in the blue box, the student who was a 52 in the winter in green, hey, celebrate, they're low risk. But then when we get to the spring, they're 63. Oh no, they've gone backwards, they're yellow. They actually grew, they went from 52 to 63, so they actually made academic growth, but they fell in that risk level because they didn't keep the pace we wanted them to keep. So yes, we didn't keep the pace we wanted to keep, but it's not like they actually went backwards. It's not like they didn't grow. There was growth. Or if you look at the side box, that top bar that's all red for that kiddo from fall, winter, and spring, they started at 21 and they went to a 43. I mean, they doubled their score. They didn't keep the pace that Fastbridge just set, like these are our benchmarks. We didn't do that, and that's what Jill said. Sometimes we have to look for aggressive growth, and we have to surround these kiddos with whatever support we can to create that aggressive growth. But it's not like there was no growth. But I think when you just look at the colors, sometimes you think, oh, there's no growth at all. Or you might think they went backwards. They didn't keep the pace, but they were growing. Does that help? Okay. All right, Colin, slide to the right. 2. Sure.
Side note, not just about the data, would be, does Fastbridge look and see how many kids had preschool before the kindergarten, or is it just about this assessment? Can we do kind of a comparison on that sometime, not like next year?
We can
you
do
know?
anything you want.
I can
Oh,
I can
I was
answer
just
that.
curious.
I can answer that. FastBridge does not monitor
Yeah.
that. That would be something we would do internally.
But
Yeah,
I
and
will,
again, I'm not asking for each student, I'm just asking for an overall, like, one-sentence statement of,
well, and I can tell you, we have not collected that in the past. This school year with this kindergarten enrollment was the first time we asked, which preschool did you attend?
Awesome.
And we did that to help with our recruitment for kindergarten warm-up, to do some more, preliminary school skills for kindergarten readiness. So that is something while we wouldn't have it for this year's data, we can go back, or we can look at that as we look at next year's kindergarten class to see those correlations.
awesome, thanks.
You're welcome.
All right, the next slide, we have first grade early reading. So this is a very similar one to the kindergarten one we just looked at, and kind of similar results. We were off the pace, 3.08 points. And then you look at the bottom, our risk levels were not where we wanted them to be at the end of the year. So this is one that Dr. Valter and I and the elementary principals, we kind of dug deep into this, and we ended up into individual classrooms trying to locate, exactly, there were no big patterns and trends, just like the kindergarten data. So it's like we got to dig deeper and deeper till we can find out exactly, what can we do better? And this is an area where we're going to have to do that. So when these kiddos are heading into second grade, we have to look at their fall scores in second grade, identify exactly what are the skills we need to focus on, what kids do we need to surround with support, so we can get these numbers up to the success levels we want for these kiddos. Next slide, Colin. The cohorts, this is kind of looking at the kiddos who are in first grade this year. If you look at the top of the chart, where they were in winter, 26% were in high risk. When they were in kindergarten, the first time they took this, 26% high risk. And at the end of first grade, we had reduced that down to 15. So I said we're not where we want to be, but where they started and where they ended the first grade, we're moving in the right direction. Not exactly at the pace we want, but we are moving in the right direction. Second grade A reading. So A reading is an adaptive test. So this one's going to be depending upon how kiddos perform.
Greg, we got a question.
Oh, sorry.
Does first grade take the CBM reading,
Yes.
CMB reading? Is that
They only
not
take
on here?
it at the end of the year, so they don't take it all the time.
Okay, so there's no, thank you.
I can also add that the CBM reading score is in the composite. It's part of the early reading assessment, so it's within their composite score.
So second grade A reading there. This one, if you look at the graph, so this is the first time we outperformed the national mean, and we also outgrew. So we outpaced them, we were growing at a higher rate, and we actually outperformed them by 8.28 points. And then if you look at the bottom with the risk levels, a nice thing to look at. Now, this is just a satellite view. We, of course, always dig deeper, but it's nice to look that we cut the high risk in half from 17 to 9%. With the second grade A reading. So that's one of the tests. Now what's important when we get into second grade and third grade is they're going to take A reading, which is a kind of an overall, and it's an adaptive test. They're going to take auto reading, which is very specific skills, and then they're going to take the CBM. So when we look at kids, it's great to celebrate the success of one, but we have to triangulate that data and look at all three of those tests to make sure, exactly where our needs with these kids. So the second one is second grade CBM reading. So this one a lot of these are almost like what I want to call a push because we are right at a point or under a point or just over a point with the growth. So we were just off the pace, 1.04 points from the national mean, but we did outperform the national mean. We didn't grow at the same rate, but we were above them the whole time. And then if you look, we went from 17 to 6 in our high risk, so we cut our high risk by 2/3 on that test. Then this next slide is the CBM cohort. So one kind of point I want to look at, when you look at the high risk from the winter of first grade to the spring of second grade, it went from 8 to 6, but I'd rather look over and celebrate that in the spring of 21-22, these second graders, 82% of them were in the low risk category where we want them.
It's low risk plus college placement.
It's low risk plus college pathway. But that's where we want. We want to be in that column.
The high-risk category goes from 9 to 18 between the spring and the summer. Do you just think, is there a reason for that? I mean, is it just the summer slide, or? Is this just tested at a time that?
It's a slightly different test. It's a first grade test to a second grade test. Kids have been off school for a little bit. We hit them. I think it's a factor of multiple things. But it's nice to look kind of how they were at 1 year to where they grow the next year and look at those multiple years of cohorts. But it's always important also to look at within 1 year, how did we do?
Julie, it may also be a different students enrolling in our district too. Although we're looking at it through a cohort, there are variables such as kids enrolling or leaving the district that kind of can trigger some numbers to go one way or another as well.
Next slide is I think it's our last second grade slide here, auto reading. So this one's the one that's a test on very specific skills. We outperformed the national mean. We were 0.25 of a point, so 1/4 of a point off the pace. And then our celebration down here at the bottom is that we have 77% in that low risk and college pathway. And Dr. Volter and I believe if you look at the column with the fall that only had 1% in high risk, we think there was something wrong, an anomaly there. We're not buying that there was only 1% in the fall in the high risk. We think something was incorrect with that. But if it would have been in the spring, I'd have said, no, that's correct. That's exactly what it was. But it didn't work out that way. But we're still very happy with the 77%. Still a little work to do, but on the right track there. Next slide, we move into third grade, A reading. So this one, once again, we outperformed the national mean, and we were 0.35 of a point off the pace. And then at the bottom, if you look, it's kind of this is another one where I say we have to triangulate and take a deep dive because it's kind of a push. We went from our numbers of the bottom two quadrants there, the 22 and 10 to 20 and 12. It's not the growth we want. So that's where, okay, we didn't, data is data. Sometimes you can't get too high with the highs and too low with the lows. You just have to respond to it. So when we have something that's like, that's not exactly what we wanted, next year we have to figure out why was that and what can we do? How can we make that better? So this is one third grade A reading we have to take a deeper look at.
Dr. Hamby,
Yes.
I'm sorry if you're repeating yourself, can you explain to me one more time exactly what the college pathways section means?
Do you want to do that, Jill?
Sure. So it's really should be titled advanced, and that's really what it is. I mean, I think it's a little off for looking at students in K through 3 and using that term college pathway. It's something that Fastbridge uses, but we'll be changing it to advanced for next year so that I think it's a better way to describe where students are.
Thank you.
And it's pretty much students who are performing at the 85th percentile or higher.
All right, let's see. Did I skip one here? Am I on third grade CBM, is that correct? Okay, third grade CBM. So CBM is the one where the kiddos are going to read a passage and there will be some comprehension, accuracy, and fluency that we're measuring with the CBM, curriculum-based measurement. So this one, we were 5.43 points off that growth, the pace of growth we wanted to have. But at the bottom, if you look, we only have 5% of our students in the high-risk column. So it didn't quite keep the pace we wanted, but they came in pretty good, and we cut our high risk in half still in third grade. And then our next slide is a cohort. So this is one, it's like, okay, our high risk from when the kids were in winter of first grade all the way to the spring of second, 3% high risk, which we were doing well. This is finally when we started, like, our phonemic awareness and our phonics we had gotten those programs into the classrooms, and we're doing those things and trying to address the needs that we had. COVID hit, took a step back. We finally feel like we're back, with that 3 to 5%, 87% to 85%. It's a little bit off, but we finally feel like we've gotten back to where we were before with our reading results. I do want to point out that the fall, when these kids were in fall of second grade, when they came back from the COVID break at 19% high risk, and then now they're back to just 5% high risk. Third grade auto reading. So this one, we once again outperformed the national average, and our pace on the growth, we were just off 0.61 points. Not a great deal of change down at the bottom, but once again, 80% of the kids are in the green category that we want them to be. So always when we're seeing those 80s, pretty happy with that. All right, then we're going to move into some math assessments. This is iReady. So iReady Classroom Mathematics is our new math program we adopted last year. So it's our first year with the program. Teachers got training last summer, and they implemented the program this year. Brand new for everyone. It's a little different. The pace of it's a little slower, and sometimes the teachers, they want to go a little faster with it. And I was trying, no, it's not what it's meant to do. We got to take our time and really build number sense. That's why we chose this one. So they have a diagnostic test that we give 3 times over the school year. Kindergarten does not give the fall one. We wait till winter before we just inundate these kindergartners with assessments. But we're going to use kind of the same kind of graphs we did for the iReady math as we did with the fast words reading. So in kindergarten, so these are once again the 2019 national norms for fast words. Next slide, Colin, I'm sorry. Mr. Davitt, next slide. Thank you. Versus our first year in it. So I want to go to the bottom. I think it tells the top, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of difference, but at the bottom you see our kindergarten students, in the winter, 51% of them were on grade level on target, and we upped that to 77% by the end of the year. And as we move into first grade, we outperformed and outgrew the national mean, and then we took our 12% on grade level in first grade at the beginning of the year to 64%.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
Like one level, it says, less than 1 level, less than 2, or is a level a grade level?
It is, but it's somewhat deceiving because if you're above there, you're going to see when we get into second grade, now you can be more than a grade level above. And you could be just slightly, one concept, 1 month, 1 unit above, and you'll be in that high level. And the same thing goes with the yellow. You might just be like 1 unit below where you're supposed to be, but you drop from the green to the yellow. So it's, once again, not too high with the highs, not too low with the lows. It just lets us keep kind of a temperature of where our kiddos are. And once again, always looking to have as many as we can in the green and as few as possible in the red is always the goal.
Thank you.
All right, so that was first grade. Let's move on to second grade. So second grade, at the top, we outperformed the national mean. And if you look at the bottom, we went from 16% on grade level to 67% on grade level throughout the year. And as we get into third grade, we outperformed, and we slightly, ever so slightly, less than 1 point, but we did outpace the national mean. And then if you look, we went from 16% on grade level to actually 61%, because we have 59 that are on grade level plus 2% that are more than a grade level above in third grade. So it's from 16 to 61 on grade level there. Now that was the end of our kind of the data that looks the same. So I put in some bonus slides because I know you guys like bonus slides. And this is some information that iReady shares. I meet with them quarterly and they share information with me. So that was interesting. So I want to start with a column that's on the far right, and that's our Lindbergh data at the end of the year. So that's our Lindbergh spring data. The column that's in the middle is the national average. So you can kind of look at how we performed at Lindbergh versus the middle column is how all other schools that are using iReady performed. But the column on the far left is the pre-pandemic or the 2019 national average. So we're kind of always looking at that one. How are we comparing to that one? So if we go to the next slide, Colin, you can look at, here's our different grade levels as we go across. And what I wanted to point out is that kindergarten, first and second, we outperformed the pre-pandemic national norm. Not even comparing what other schools are doing this year, we outperformed the levels of 2019. Third grade and fourth grade were pretty much equal to the pre-pandemic, and fifth grade was the only one that was a little bit off pace, but barely. So I thought it was interesting data to share.
Can I ask one question?
Yeah.
These are norms for the districts that use iReady. Do we know anything about what kind of districts those are, where they are? Because I would think that if you were to look at a true national norm, I would want Lindbergh to be higher. But if you're looking at iReady and the schools that use it and the districts that use it are similar to Lindbergh, then it makes more sense that we're matching it. So do we have that kind of information?
It is going to be far and wide. It's a nationwide program used in school districts that are going to be urban, suburban, rural, affluent, not affluent. It's a pretty good cross mix. Same thing with Fastbridge, I'd probably say the same thing.
With NWEA, I think they use in their study, they use 8.3 million students. I mean, it was so many students from all over. So it's I can only speak for the NWEA study. I haven't done the iReady study in the same way, but it's so many students all over, and then they throw everybody in that particular bell curve, so.
But I think your point is really valid, because that's not where we see ourselves either. We don't see Lindbergh as performing at the national norms. And I think that's what this slide highlights so well, is right now, no one's performing at the national norms. So the fact that we are performing at the national norms shows the acceleration that we're able to do during the last couple of years. So we should see, as this kind of evens out and we mitigate those skills and those opportunities for kids that they still need, that we accelerate past those national norms.
And I don't want the point to be lost that with the hard work of the teachers and those kiddos that love math, because all kids love math, right? That this was our first year using this program. And, we're right there with everyone in the first year. I think we're only going to get better. And also the kids are in this that are, down there in second grade right now. Let's see, I really think by the time they're in fourth or fifth grade, they're going to be doing phenomenal, because they'll have multiple years in the program. The teachers will have multiple years teaching the program, so I think it's just going to get better. And then one last slide with iReady. It's kind of a growth quadrant. So if you look at the top, you always want to be in, so you have low performance and high growth, and we have high performance and high growth. Of course, we always want to be in the high performance and high growth, but I think it's always important at least to be in the high growth at all times. And so all of our grade levels are in the high growth, and we have first, second, and third are all in the high performance and high growth. So I was really proud of how everyone did with that. So I thought it was, a little point to brag about, and I wanted to share that with you guys.
A real quick question that may not fit here, but since we're flipping to the older grades, at what point do we ask the kids metacognitively how they felt about taking the test afterwards? I know that all schools do a lot of testing and things like that, but do we have any qualitative, statements from students starting in third grade, if I'm in the red, is it because I don't care if I'm in the red? When do we ask them about that? I know there's test fatigue and things like that. And I think Lindbergh does an excellent job with, just picking the right assessments we need to do. But when do we ask the kids?
So I don't have any tool where we have actually asked the students, how did you feel about this particular assessment? So I'm listening to your question and taking it as feedback also at the same time. The one thing I can tell you is looking at patterns and trends of our students in the spring that are performing on grade level or above in the winter and in the fall, and dipping in the spring. Students who are on track and doing really well, just saying, I'm done. And we'll see that decrease. We'll see a rapid guessing percentage go up for particular students in the spring. And I don't want to, I think not using that as an excuse for things, but I think it is a variable that plays into some of our spring results, where students have just taken the state math test, and then we ask them to take NWEA, innocence weeks after, and we start to see them I'm out a little bit. And that's not every particular student, it's a few students, but we do see that. And that in itself is not a survey qualitative approach of seeing how kids do, but we can look at that and say they're tired. And it's been a long year. So I think we can get a little bit of information from them in that particular way as well.
Because I like what Craig said, even about learning this new test and procedures and stuff like that too. So I could also see some students the second time they see it, being like, oh, aha, this is the format of the test. This is what I feel about the test and things like that, which would be great. So almost, I wasn't really in my mind when I asked the question, although I appreciate your answer about the spring slide, but more just, maybe in the fall and spring, if they answered the same way, I didn't give them my best, and working with the students on that piece, because you don't really need to sometimes with the EOCs and the ACT and the AP and things like that, different. So there's that sweet spot of that, 3rd through 7th grade. Yeah.
Which really speaks to the need to engage kids in setting goals for themselves and feeling that sense of like pride and, wow, look what I've done, look what I've learned, and I'm going to celebrate that. And I feel like I want to see what can I do on my own. But to Jill's point about spring, Craig mentioned this earlier, that we have some inconsistencies that we see that we can't quite figure out why does that pattern or lack of pattern exist. We see some cases where students actually significantly outperform the fall of the following year after compared to what they did in the spring of the previous summer. So exactly opposite of what we were talking about with some of that FastBridge data where there was a significant drop in the fall. Sometimes with NWEA, we're seeing a significant growth in the fall when kids are kind of energized. I will say anecdotally, we often hear from students also that the reading passages in assessments are not the most engaging. And that's because they're open source reading passages. So keeping kids excited about reading things that maybe they did not choose can have a level of impact.
Thank you.
I also have a question before we move on to NWEA. Are the 4th and 5th graders do iReady? It's part of the math program we use. Are those results not being shared because we're using the NWEA results? Okay. I think that was my only question.
So just to answer that is, iReady, although it's used as part of a curriculum, formative assessment in the classroom, it's not a district required assessment. So it's not in our district assessment plan, it's part of the curriculum, but we are using the K-3 component as part of our district assessment program.
And are those results, the iReady results, shared with parents on SIS?
They will be starting next year.
Okay.
After 1 year of administration, we'll start to share them.
Thank you.
One last thing that, interesting, not really a self-assessment, Dr. Lorenz, but one interesting thing that iReady does is that when we look at the data, sometimes there's a little red flag there. And if we click on it, it'll tell us this student rushed through the test, because it kind of has how long it should take for a student to do it, and if someone completes it quicker. And usually those students are in the red and they get a red flag because they just zip through it. So it's a nice little feature. Next slide, Kellen. So we have our NWEA data, so I'm going to talk about the 4th and 5th grade before we transition over to Dr. Zagora. So I'm almost finished. I just have a few more slides. Next slide, Colin. So this one is broken, it's a little different, it's broken into quintiles. So we are looking, our goal is to be in the top 3 quintiles, so in the average, high average, or the high, and stay out of the low average and the low. So next slide, Colin. When we get into our data, here's our 4th grade. We have reading on the left and we have math on the right. So let's look at reading first. So we outperformed the national mean, but we were slightly about 1.5 points off on our pace of growth. And then at the bottom, we had 78% of our students in the top 3 quintiles in the fall, and we dropped that down to 76 in the spring. So that's when it's like, okay, we got to figure out, we got to deep dive into this NWEA data and find out, what can we do? What can we do better? We didn't meet what we wanted to, so what can we do better? Now, the good news is when we look over at the math, we outperformed and outgrew the national average, and then we went from 74% of students in the top 3 quintiles to 78%. And as we move to our 5th grade NWEA, we outperformed once again in the reading, slightly off the pace, about not quite 2 points off the pace, and we did slip a little bit from 76 in the top 3 quintiles to 71% in the top 3 quintiles in our reading, but rebounded in math where we outperformed and outgrew the national average, and we went from 67 to 69% in the top 3 quintiles. And then we have a cohort look at how our students did from the students who took the NWEA in 4th and 5th grade. When you look at our reading, we had that dip, and we dipped from 76 in the top 3 quintiles to 71 in reading. And then in math, we stayed even Steven. It was 69 and 69. But one thing in the math, I wanted a smiley face I drew on my notes, was that in the above average, or above the high average, the very high, our 4th graders, when they were in 4th grade in math, there were only 13% in that top quintile, and that went up to 21%. So good thing that happened there. And then my next slide, I want to get into our highlights and opportunities. So some of the highlights, just to summarize what I've been talking about for the last 55 minutes, is I feel like we're keeping pace with the pre-pandemic norms, which we kind of compare ourselves in both FastBridge and iReady. Our second grade A reading, our high risk was reduced to 9%. Second grade auto reading, our high risk was reduced to 7%, and our second grade CBM was high risk reduced to 6%. Next slide, Colin. Third grade CBM, high risk reduced to 5%. Third grade auto reading is outperforming the national mean. iReady K through 5, all grade levels had high growth. That's actually 1 through 5. We don't have the growth on K. And then iReady K through 3 were high performance and high growth. And then our fourth and fifth grade NWEA, we outperformed and outpaced the national means in both grade levels in math. And then now we'll move on to opportunities. Next slide. For reading, it's finding time for our professional learning communities to take that deep dive into data. It starts with, usually Jill and I talked to one of the principals today about, it starts with the admin in the building kind of looking at all our pieces of data and doing that triangulation and trying to find those areas. And then that ends up going back to having the conversations with teachers and figure out, what do you think happened that we didn't meet the goals we wanted to meet? What can we do differently? What should we try differently this year? And it's different students, but we had the conversation today as we looked at, we had one of the principals in, it's like, okay, here's the Dreambox data says our fourth grade wasn't doing good at measurement. And then NWA says we didn't do good at measurement. And iReady says we didn't do good at measurement. Well, guess what? We need to have a conversation and say, hey, we didn't meet the goals we set for measurement this year. What do we think we can do differently? What can we do more so that we can raise this up? And we were looking at throwing in some MAP scores too. So we have multiple pieces of data, but when you see the same thing pop up over and over, it's like, okay, that's something we have to address with our instruction. As I said early when I was talking, we have to look at the growth levels beyond just the risk levels, because you can dig deeper and get a better story. And sometimes it's like, well, I know they're down the high risk, but we are showing some good growth. But we also have to look, yeah, they're up at the low risk, but we're not seeing the rate of growth we want. So we have to look at everybody and make sure we're getting the growth we need. That's kind of, sometimes we need further diagnostics when we don't see that growth to try and really pinpoint what the deficiency might be. And then we turn around and we plan instruction to respond to the needs of the students. We got another reading slide there, Colin. Continuing in reading to build foundational skills, that's developing those decoding skills that kiddos need there in K and 1, and then working our way up into comprehension strategies, and all along the way trying to develop a robust vocabulary. One of the things that I think everyone will say that helps to become a better reader is if you develop your vocabulary. And then finally, with our reading opportunities, is just making sure kids have time to read. We have to have time to practice our craft with them. And
Can I ask a question before
yes.
you go to math? Do we have enough reading specialists to help the kids who are high risk?
I would like to have one reading specialist per grade level per building. So, Joel, I'm sorry I said that.
Yeah.
You know what, we have great people. We use a systematic way to service our students, but if you ever ask me, could you use more help? I'm always gonna say, absolutely. We could definitely have more people out there helping. So I'm trying to answer without answering. So yeah, we'll always take help, absolutely. But I do think the staff we are doing a wonderful job with our kids.
And I think the way that we staff reading specialists too is important to note. So one of the things that Craig has done over the course of this last year is really look at reevaluating so that it's not you get this number of reading specialists in your building because you have this many students, but look at the needs of the students in that building. We've always had additional staff in our Title I buildings to support additional interventions, but that doesn't mean that that's always where the risk level lies. So being able to really target and ensure that no matter which elementary building you are in, if you are at high risk, that there are the resources and the people there in that building, that we're spreading our resources throughout all the buildings.
Fifth grade seemed to struggle a little bit, and thank you all. I know you've worked very hard over the past 2 to 3 years to put new programs in. Is there a difference? Is it a longer test or a different test, comparison from fourth to fifth grade? Or what do we maybe think might be going on there?
There's a couple things. I think it'll take a little bit, I think those fourth and fifth grade numbers will improve over time as teachers and students get more used to this program and they're developing better number sense. And fifth grade, as former fifth grade teacher, fifth grade math is always really rigorous. So it's not easy. And there is a jump in the rigor of those tests, in my opinion.
Okay.
So it's not anything, it's a difficult test, and we'll keep doing our best to prepare them, but I do think you're going to see improvement. We'll matriculate up over the next few years as we have the program longer.
Okay, thank you.
But I also think just something to keep in mind with our fifth graders. So let's just go down their journey. And again, this is not an excuse, but this is also, to Kathy's point and to Craig, as we learn our testing program and we become familiar, we get comfortable in a testing environment, all of those things. These third graders did not take us, these fifth graders were third graders when we sent them home after spring break in 2020. So they didn't take a state assessment that year. Last year's testing environment was not our normal. Would we do it over 2 days instead of spread out? If they were in session, if they were doing ARC last year, some kids didn't come in and take it. This is their first year to really have that testing experience in that platform. And again, that is not an excuse, but I will be curious to watch them grow as that happens. And so I also think that can contribute a little bit to our kindergartners and things like that, because when you see first and second, but then when we have them in second and third and starting to see that starting to get caught up. So I think what I would say, and I know we're going to have Ronnie talk about it, is we now have the tools for our teachers throughout the year to have conversations about their academic growth. When you look at things like state assessments and things, that's what I would refer to as an autopsy. You do it one time, you get that score, and then you move on to the next year. There isn't that opportunity like we have now with these tools where you can sit down with Johnny or Susie and say, hey, you weren't very good at number sense. What's your plan? What are we going to do before we take that next test? And I think that's what it's about, because I think everyone in this room can say that they learned something and that light maybe took them a little bit longer for it to click, and it maybe didn't happen over that year, but a year later it did. And again, I think it's important that this is about the journey of where we have a kid and how do we progress them through our system to make sure that they are growing and there is growth. Yes, we want that accelerated growth and we want them all on grade level as quick as we can, but we have tools now where we didn't have before that a kid, oh, I'm always below basic, or I'm always basic. There isn't that hope. Now we have tools to generate this hope in our kids about learning that says, hey, look, you grew this much. You're not quite where you need to be yet. How are we going to get there? And that's what these tools are about. And so I think that's really important, and I don't want that to get lost in just looking at numbers and looking at all of those things. So these are some very powerful tools that our teachers will just get better and better at in using and helping our kids grow academically. So.
One last slide, Colin. Opportunities in math. It's kind of like building the foundational skills in reading and the decoding. We have to build good number sense. Chrissy, kind of like I just said, it will improve over time. And then the main thing I have to pull the reins sometimes on the teachers, is we got to take our time, respond to the needs of our kids, and not just rush trying to finish a program or finish a book. But it's like, well, what do our kids need? Do we need a little more time? We take a little bit more time. Because I'd rather build really good number sense and be off that pace a little bit, but in the long run, do the best thing we can for kids. Because if we go too fast down in K1 and 2, those are the students who have trouble when they're up in 4 and 5. And then once again, as I said in reading, we'll use the data to respond to the student needs and do the best to tailor our instruction to get the most success. So before I turn it over to Dr. Zagora, what questions might you have?
I was just going to ask on both the reading and the math about after-school opportunities. We talked a lot about the teacher and during the class and interventions and things like that, but opportunities for growth for kids after school?
Outside of the school day, I don't know, we do some tutoring through community ed. I'm not sure exactly how many of those opportunities are. But even within the school day, outside your normal reading and math, the teachers have done a great job of trying to carve out other pieces of time, or they do some flexible grouping. They might even be trading some students from classroom to classroom to make some intervention groups that they need to do. So the teachers have been really good about being creative to try and get the most out of their day. There's a finite number of minutes in a day, and they squeeze every millisecond out of them. But it's something that, outside of the community ed, I don't know, Tara, help me out here. I'm not a lot of stuff springing to mind academically.
I think our biggest support is the summer, additional learning time in summer. I mean, one of the challenges I think, and this is my personal opinion, is, students' readiness to continue learning for a longer day. At what, to what degree does that have impact? Going back to the conversation around fatigue, you've already had a hard day doing hard stuff that stretches you and pushes you. Do you have the wherewithal to do more of that in a single day? So how we can use the time that we have in summer school. And as you guys know, our summer school has expanded exponentially over the last few years as we've tried to support the learning growth that needs to continue to happen, and then mitigate that summer slide for our students as well.
I just want to add one thing, because I think that looking at interventions is great, and we have individual students, and I know Special School District is implementing some new reading intervention programs that we've been working on for the past few years, and they are going to be in full effect. So we'll be monitoring that program effectiveness as well. But while we're looking at student individual interventions, which is something we definitely should be doing, we should also be looking at going back to that satellite view and how can we use this data to also address what are the things that we're doing in the classroom, tier 1, for all students that are definitely getting us to the place that we want to be. And so while we're looking at strong interventions, also teachers looking at their pacing, the resources, monitoring our students getting it along the way, and then being responsive in the classroom too, is how we also want to look at the data for both purposes. So I think that will also be helpful. And as Dr. Lake said, as teachers get more familiar with using some of these tools, I just want to kind of go back and show some grace to the teachers who began implementing NWEA in the midst of a pandemic when we were not even in the classroom. They were they were trying to learn to do this. I'm trying to capture them to teach it, and they were doing that. So as they become more familiar in how they can use the data to help support the classroom, I think that we will continue to see that growth as well.
Does this data include our English language learners and students with IEPs? Yes? And then
Yes.
do teachers and or administrators have opportunities to evaluate the assessments themselves to make sure that they are equitable for students and that the students are able to I'm just thinking off of experience, like I had when I was teaching 3rd grade, we had a state assessment and an entire reading and writing piece was on a visit to an arboretum, and I had probably 95% of my students were English language learners and didn't know what an arboretum was. So how can we expect them to perform well when that base knowledge is not there? And so I was just wondering if there's any evaluation process of the actual assessments for us to kind of keep track on that.
Well, because it's a normed assessment, we're never going to have access to the actual questions or the passages that they provide, because that would, I guess, break the integrity of the assessment. But we do have teachers who are always looking over the students' shoulders and looking at those particular passages. And we have given NWEA specifically some feedback on how are they, that some of the passages just seem to be the canons, and it's because of the open resource and what's free to use, but we have given them that. And they responded with, that is a priority for us, that we are looking at who's taking our tools. And also, it's not even about just the passages, but the accessibility of the assessments for students who struggle having text-to-speech and just multiple opportunities for kids, speech-to-text opportunities we give our kids so that everybody can access the assessment. So, but I don't have that evaluation tool like with data on how people have said, but we have given feedback to the vendors with some of those concerns.
We've talked a lot about the kids who need help, but what about the kids who are already really doing really well? So how do we balance these kids need more help without leaving the kids who are doing really great behind and having them continue to learn too.
Oh, sorry. I think it's part of what I was trying to say with those kids who are in the green. We have to look at their growth numbers also, because just because they're in the green doesn't mean, we want them to grow. We want to see years growth out of them as well. And kind of when we're talking about being flexible groups and recognize kids that might need a little help, that plays for the enrichment side of it as well. So usually when we're trading some groups for remediation, we're doing the same thing with enrichment. It's like, I have some kids I need to challenge, and so do you have a couple. Let's put them together and work smarter here. So teachers really collaborate a lot so we can meet the needs of everyone on both ends of our charts.
So Julia, back to that point. So when we started this conversation 4 years ago, we talked about, who got left behind and No Child Left Behind was your high performers, because everyone in here that was a building principal, a teacher during the height of No Child Left Behind, we were drilling and killing in teaching to a test. And we were leaving, these kids right up here, that we knew they were going to be proficient no matter what. They could show up and get the score they needed. And this tool right here now holds us accountable for those high-performing kids. It says, hey, this is where they are. To Craig's point, they're in the green, but are we growing them? And that's what we want. We want to be held accountable for every kid's growth, no matter where they are, and we have tools for that now. Our state assessment doesn't necessarily give us that information that we need to be held accountable, so.
I don't have it in the slideshow, but I'll share in a board packet. I think I had one due today, Tara, that maybe I'll get that to you guys next week. I knew you were going to have enough of me today that you didn't want that to. But it does show that it's iReady, and I was looking at one classroom from one of our elementaries, and at first glance, you're like, there's quite a few kids in the red. But then when I looked at their growth, even those kids in the red were making over 100% growth in that year. They were just, far behind. So it's, when you dig into it, it tells more the truth. But it always gives us that percent of growth. So even those kids in the high green, we got to make sure that they're showing that full year's growth also. So we've got some tools that really help us track that.
With these assessments, do teachers get, how timely is the feedback that teachers get after students take these tests?
So the iReady is pretty immediate.
Okay.
Because they can click right in and look at their own results. And the teacher, now some of the reports that we prepare for you, we got to cobble it together from multiple buildings, but a teacher themselves within FastBridge and iReady, I'll speak to those two, they can get in pretty quickly and look at their own classroom results immediately.
So they're able to then immediately start setting goals for their students and giving parents feedback about this is what we need to work on, this is the action steps we're going to take.
Yeah, and sometimes it just takes us a little bit longer if we got to collect from all 6 buildings and put the grade levels together to prepare a report to show like this overall growth. That takes a little bit of time, but a teacher themselves can log right into FastBridge, log right into iReady, click diagnostic results, there's your class.
And then teachers in a PLC can then also talk about what they're seeing on their own results in their own classroom, and then can start collaborating on different ways. So if you have a teacher that their students are doing well in a certain area, you can then start collaborating on what is it that you're doing in your classroom, how can I bring it in my classroom?
Yeah, it's a great way to, exactly what you're describing, is we can compare strategies of, hey, what are you doing? I need to be able to do more of that, but also that being able to put some of those kids together. It's like, I've got some kids here too that have the same deficiency. Let's be smart about how we're going to approach this with our small groups or our interventions. So, and all that happens in our professional learning communities. All right, I'm going to shut my mic off and let Dr. Zagora take over.
And we're out of time, so thank you for being here. I don't want one of those red flags to pop up that I moved through too quickly, but I recognize that we're running short on time. So as I talk about middle and high school academic data, with the NWEA map growth for reading and math, that's what we have for 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And so you'll see some similar trends that you saw with 4th and 5th grade. But to just make some statements across the board about what we see in middle school, because it is a similar story in all 3 grade levels, that we do see some cohort growth, and we across the board we see that Lindbergh performance, we outperform that national mean, fall, winter, and spring. And again, that national mean is from 2020 pre-pandemic. And so we are outperforming that national mean. But we also see some things that are really compelling us to ask a lot of questions. So I don't come to you necessarily with the answers for why we see what we see. This is only the second year that we have used this assessment. And so we are really at a point of, as Dr. Sparks said at the outset, we're using this as a baseline to generate the right questions to ask, to work with our teachers, to support our teachers. And so to Matt's point earlier about, our PLCs using this data, we had obviously 2 unusual years, and our instructional coaches really stepped up during that time. And at the middle school level, they have been pushing into these PLCs and working with the teachers to understand what do these NWEA reports show and how do you use that, both at the building level, the teacher level, and at the student level as well. And so we've learned a lot. We have a lot left to learn. So what you have here first is 6th grade, and again above you can see our mean versus the national mean, and then you see those quintiles. And so what we see in 6th grade reading, and you'll see this in a few of the others as well, is that we see that our performance in winter is actually a little bit better than our performance in the spring. And I know we've talked about that already, and what are the possible reasons for that. And I think, these are complex questions. There's never a single answer that says, oh, this is why that happened. But it is important to consider that as, our students get older, our middle and high school students, we are sometimes battling against things like testing fatigue or student apathy. And so those are the questions we need to ask about why we're seeing what we're seeing. Our middle school students take 2 state assessments in the spring. Our 8th grade students take 3 state assessments in the spring. And these NWEA assessments were given after this most recent school year. And so it's a contributing factor perhaps, but certainly not an excuse, but a question to ask to keep looking into. If you go ahead to the next slide, we'll look at the cohort change that we've seen. And so we do see a slight uptick from 5th grade to 6th grade. So this is that same group of students, for the most part, same group of students, their spring assessment in 5th grade versus 6th grade. And we do see that we went from 65% in that average, high, average, and high to 66% with our 6th graders, which is good. It may seem like marginal growth, but we know that those transition points of 6th and 9th grade are often where sometimes we see our students take a bit of a dip in that transition to a new experience, but we did see cohort growth, and that's encouraging. Next slide. This is back one. There you go. This is our math cohort, and so we saw a little bit of a dip here, 66% with our 5th graders in those top 3 quintiles to 63% of our 6th graders. So something we're looking into with those math skills, and our PLCs are taking a look at that as well. We did have new math resources this year, and so we've had a lot of new things over a couple of years. So anytime we're introducing something new, we always expect that there might be just that period of getting used to it and getting our students used to it as well.
Do the students who are in 6th grade taking 7th grade math take the same test as the 6th graders or the 7th graders?
So something that's really amazing about NWEA is that it is adaptive. So it's just a student starts the test, they start with question 1, and depending on if they get the question right, it will increase in complexity, and if they get the question wrong, it will decrease in complexity. So why these adaptive assessments are so much, this is kind of pretentious, but so much more superior to like state level assessments is because there's no ceiling or floor. So like when you're talking about a state level assessment, the students test within the grade level and that's where they are. We don't know how far above, we don't know what advanced means. We don't know what basic means when we take a state level assessment, but when we take an adaptive assessment like NWEA or A reading in FastBridge or iReady with mathematics, the students are all taking a test and growing, and so it really just depends on where they are. And then we can see what grade level they're kind of performing in comparison to peers. So it's not a 6th grade test, a 7th grade test, or an 8th grade test. It's actually, when they get to 6th grade, the test is just called 6+. So, and the scores will range all the way up to 12th grade.
All right, next slide. So So here we have our 7th grade scores on NWEA in reading and math. Again, outperforming that national mean set before the pandemic. But what you see here, a little bit more pronounced in the 7th grade reading, is that, we want those bottom 2 quintiles, that yellow and red, to shrink as the year goes on. And we do see it shrink down in the winter, and then we see it grow a little bit more in the spring on both of those. And again, this, back to the beginning of this evening's presentation, it does not necessarily mean that individual students didn't show growth. They may have shown growth, even significant growth, but it may not have been enough to move them out of one quintile into another. So when we get to the opportunities section, I'll talk a little bit about what we can do with individual students there. Next slide. This is our 7th grade reading cohort. Excuse me, there's a fly circling my face. So here we saw some strong growth. We saw our 6th grade students, 68% of them were in those top 3 quintiles. Our 7th grade students, we jumped up to 71%. We had 35 students that grew enough to move a whole quintile. And so we are seeing increases with these groups of students. We know there's individual growth, and we're seeing that whole grade level cohort growth from year to year. Next slide. And in math, we also see some good cohort growth, with 66% of our 6th graders in those top 3 quintiles, and that jumps to 68% of our 7th graders that were in those top 3. And a slight reduction there in those low categories. That's fine, you can go on, move on. We're running short on time. All right, and then here in 8th grade, this is not the trend we want, obviously, on the bottom, but still, again, outperforming that national mean. But we do see that those yellow and red quintiles grow a little bit with our 8th graders. But when I show you 9th grade here in a second, we are hopeful that those gains are made, and we make up for that as our students progress. Similar to elementary, as they get used to these assessments, as our teachers get used to using this data, that we will see that growth that we want to see. Next slide. So this is our cohort change for 8th grade, and we do see a slight reduction here from 71% of our 7th graders last year being in those top 3 quintiles to 68%. And then, I think what we see here, and you can jump to the math as well, is that we see in 8th grade that we're not seeing the growth that we want. But what I'll show you here in a second is that we're making up for those dips when our students get to high school. So in our 8th graders as well, keeping in mind that their whole middle school experience was not what middle school ought to have been. 3 grade levels interrupted, and so they, as our teachers adapted to that and our students adapted to that, we're really looking forward to getting back to, we all want to get back to what it was, or whatever the new is. All right, next slide, please. So our NWEA 9th grade students, this was actually their first year using this assessment. And we do have high mean performance. Our averages are good with our 9th grade students. We do see a similar fall to spring trend as we did with our 8th graders. And so, again, being brand new this year, our teachers were new to it, and our students, while they had taken it as 8th graders, this is a new test for our 9th graders. So if you jump to the next slide, you'll see that we did have strong cohort growth with this group. So we had 68% in those top 3 as 8th graders, and then by 9th grade, we had 71%. And we had some reductions in our low quintile there. If you look at our lowest, from 17% of them being in that low quintile in 8th grade to only 9% in 9th grade. So a good jump that we see there. And now I'm jumping into some other high school academic measures, since our NWEA does not go beyond 9th grade. This is where we get to look at other assessments, like our advanced placement assessments, our ACT. And these, tell an interesting story as well, that I think show that we are continuing to really strongly prepare our students for their post-secondary experience. So this is our 5-year trends of our AP test scores. So that's a 1 to 5 scale, and a score of a 3 or higher is considered a passing score. And we saw, obviously, a dip there during the pandemic years, but we've started to rebound and had some great passing scores, 77% this year. Next slide. And you'll see a big change that we have seen is we have seen a decrease in the number of exams taken, and there's a dual credit part to this story that I will share, because this does not mean that our students aren't taking those courses. We have a lot of students taking those courses, but we have fewer students taking the test, and that's because a lot of our students are choosing the dual credit option, which is kind of that guaranteed college credit option instead of taking that AP test. But we do still have, and I think this is something to be proud of, that we have more than 400 students a year that take an AP test, and the number of students who take an AP course would be even higher than that. So we had 733 exams taken this year. 76.7% of our students who took an AP exam got a 3 or higher on at least one of those exams.
Ronnie, what's the national average? And I know we looked that up for the AP. It's like 38, 39, 40.
I don't know it off the top of my head, but I know that we're well above it.
I think it's important for people to understand that is very impressive.
Yes.
I mean, those AP success rates it's very impressive compared to the national average of kids that take an AP exam, and it's that's something to be noted. So,
next slide. So not only do we do well on the tests, but we do very well on some of the tests. We give them 29 subject tests in our AP program, and this year we had 12 of those subject tests that had 90% of our students or higher scoring a 3 or higher, so an over 90% pass rate, and actually 5 of our tests that had a 100% pass rate. And some of those are even some of our newer courses, so we don't have years of data and years of experience to help us prepare for those exams. So I think these are some really impressive stats here. Next slide. But as I said, there's more to the story of why our number of test takers has declined. And we do have a huge and growing dual credit program, and I have spoken to you all very recently about what that looks like here in Lindbergh. And so just some data for you to see for this most recent academic year where our students were taking those courses, those partnerships that we have. It tells you how many courses we offer from those different institutions, how many seats, or in other words, how many students total across the board registered for those courses. The last two, so Missouri University of Science and Technology, that is retroactive course credit. So students who do the Project Lead the Way program, they can apply for that course credit after they've taken it. So we don't have the most recent data for that. And then this was our first year using an UMSL dual credit course, so we don't have that data as well. But we're talking about hundreds, thousands of hours of college credit that our students have earned. And I did some quick math today between St. Louis Community College and Missouri State. It is more than $800,000 of college tuition that students have saved, and if I had that data from St. Louis University, that would probably push us over $1 million of tuition saved. So in these courses, it's important to note, these are college level courses. In many cases, these are the AP courses. It is both an AP course and a dual credit course, and so this is a very rigorous, challenging experience for our students. This is not just they're taking a high school class and they get to pay a tuition fee and collect some credit. These are high level classes, and they're really preparing our kids for college after. Next slide. And then I have some ACT data to wrap up here. So we do not yet have our ACT composite average for the class of 2022 because some of those graduating seniors are still taking tests over the summer, and so we won't get that until the fall. But what we do have is we have our ACT averages for all of our students who took an ACT in this most recent school year and the prior school year. So those might be 10th, 11th, 12th grade students. That's just all the students in a given school year. And then we also have our class of 2021 ACT average scores. And so what I've put down there at the bottom of the slide is what the College Board, what ACT would tell us are college readiness benchmarks. And those are based on their research. Students who perform at that level are higher, have a higher likelihood of completing college, of getting passing grades in college and getting their degree in a timely manner. And so, as you can see, we are outperforming those benchmark scores, in some cases significantly. For example, if you look at that English benchmark of 18, and you look at our English scores, which are in the 23 to 24 range. So we are well beyond those benchmark scores, which I think is great evidence for us to hang our hats on, that we are getting our kids college ready. We are sending them to college where they are going to perform well, and maybe even show up as sophomores with all that dual credit they collected.
So I said this to Tara, I would be curious in the future, what % of our class meets the college benchmark on all 4 of those as well? And I just know from being a former high school principal in 2 high schools in Kansas City that we have a 24.4 average on the science. That's the hardest because it's a reasoning test, and that's why it's also the highest for the benchmark. The fact that our kids are above that is excellent. And then there's this thing called Google on the AP. You can find out. Kathy sent me a text. It's 60% of AP kids got a 3, so almost 20% higher than the national average on that. So I knew it was significant. I just didn't know what it was. So.
Well, as long as we're adding that, for the ACT, the national composite is at 20.3, and we're at.
Almost 25, yeah, almost 25, composite.
This is, right.
Or, yeah,
24.
no, 24, sorry, I was looking at the reading, yep.
I would be interested in one more thing, just as a side note, and this is, again, later, one sentence, next year, ASVAB on here too, GED, just because if we're looking at all secondary kind of nationally, I don't know if nationally normed is the right term, but tests that kids take across the nation, I'd be interested in ASVAB.
Okay.
And the GED, thanks.
Next slide. So you've seen this before, and we of course highlighted it at our graduation, but our class of 2022 profile. And so we see our students, we prepare them well, they move on to those universities, and while it's very difficult to collect postgraduate data, especially beyond that first 180 days after they graduate from with us, we are setting that as a goal to look at what other measures we can take to collect that data. But, anecdotally, we hear year after year after year from our graduates that, boy, I got to college and I was so much better prepared than all of my classmates. We especially hear it about their college comp classes. I got to college and no one else knows how to write. So, next slide. And our highlights and opportunities here. So, as I mentioned, just to summarize, we did see some strong cohort growth despite the strange conditions in which we've been learning. We're definitely seeing a rebound from the...
Could you try again?
Excuse me. We're seeing a rebound on our AP scores after the pandemic dip, which is great. Really strong ACT scores that continue to indicate college readiness, and then that dual credit growth just really tells its own story. We know that equals college preparedness, and in addition is just such a great financial gain for our families. So one of our biggest opportunities here is to work with, and this is especially important with our secondary students, helping our students set those individual goals. Especially with the NWEA and those math and reading tests that they're taking a few times a year, is supporting our teachers to enable their students to do that goal setting and measure their own growth and have buy-in to what that assessment is telling them about what they've learned, and giving them that confidence and celebration that they can have when they see that growth. And asking those questions about, I think Kathy brought up a good point of, are we asking our students, how'd you feel about that test? And collecting some of that data so that we can make sure we're setting up the right conditions for our students to do the best that they can. And we do want to take a look at the impact of our dual credit on AP. We know we're doing good things for kids. We know that whether they take an AP test or they choose the dual credit option, that we are doing well and we're giving them those opportunities. But I say that we would like for our students to take that AP test. We think it does, not just as a helpful data point for us, but to keep their opportunities open as well. Our dual credit courses are set up so that most of them are those core 42 classes that transfer within the state of Missouri, but we also want our students to have those options where I can go anywhere, I can transfer anywhere down the road, and I have that transferable score of an AP test. And we know that we do a great job preparing them for that, and we think that they would do well. So we'll be having some conversations and asking some questions around that as well. Any questions?
It's easier to measure things for students who are planning on going to college, but for the kids, the 15.6 who plan employment, is there any way to break that down further and try to understand what they're doing to try to measure or see, maybe it can't be measured, but at least just see that what they're doing is helpful and that they're being successful?
So part of my personal goal in that postgraduate data is to get at exactly that. Because I think when we have those measures that say you're college ready and you're going to college, then I think we can have the confidence that we have done a good job in preparing them for that. But we don't get that same kind of data with our straight to workforce students. Now they do take the same assessments as our other students that we have, that are our universal assessments for all students. But things like the ASVAB, for example, we also have a lot of students that will take the AccuPlacer if they're going the community college route. So there are other measures I think that we could collect. We have some of our students that attend South Tech take like the ACT work keys, for example. So that's an assessment for students that would be planning to potentially go straight into the workforce. So I think there's more data and more opportunities there to really try to get a measure of how well those students are doing. Thank you.
And maybe with that follow-up, just send the board if we can see what we're asking the kids, because I don't know if everybody has seen that. And seen what it looks like.
Sure.
If they don't have a student that's reached that age yet or something when it comes to that.
Yeah.
I keep going back because I'm impressed about the ACT. So when you look at the 48 Missouri Bright Fight and they increase the Bright Fight scores. So, years ago it was a 30, then a 31. Now, of course, they're going to make it a 32 for the class of 2023. So seeing the 48 on there is really impressive too.
Yeah.
There we go. Now I have a microphone. I think this slide about the students and where they're going also, illuminates something else. I don't think we've ever seen a gap year at a 5.2%, the way that we're seeing this now. So it really just talks about kind of globally some trends that we're seeing. As we go on to the final slide, however, Colin, I just want to point out that when we're talking about student data, it's really a part of the student experience. That's our goal, is that we are giving students a well-rounded experience that helps them be prepared for whatever it is that is in their future. Workforce, college readiness, military, gap year. That they are ready to go. So what we've shared tonight in terms of the data, that's a piece of that. But we also need to be thinking about programming opportunities, ways that we're making learning authentic and realistic and applicable to life beyond the school experience. So I know you guys are super excited about our book study. So you can see you all have a copy of What School Could Be, and we've got our first workshop to discuss it in October, where we'll discuss through page 102, and then we'll wrap it up in January. But it's really a good marriage between those foundational skills that we know are essential for our students to be successful, and then the way that we build programs and support and educational experiences that help them apply those skills in a way that you can't measure on all of the data that we've seen here today. Those skill sets that are really about the application and the authenticity that you have to take and apply in life.
And the board members that were on, that we have the two new ones, we were going to discuss this, and then the pandemic hit. So we read this a little while ago. So any of our current board members have misplaced their book or needs a copy of the book, let us know, and we will. Oh, you got it? Okay, that's good. So, and again, it's a good look at making sure that those fundamental skills are there, but it's a different approach to doing that. For instance, can you teach geometry? Does it have to be in a geometry class, or can it be in a construction class and you still get the same standards and the same testing, and making it more authentic and real? Because I think we all realize that when we were engaged or had an interest or a passion in our learning, we probably all excelled in that. We all had classes in our lives that we were like, I got to do this, I got to check it off. So how can we make this learning, making sure they have those fundamental skills, those foundations, but really find their passions and drive them into that excitement, and why we have them here, and let them explore different opportunities and things. So it's a great book. So I'm excited to see and have some conversations around it.